In this presentation, we will look not so much at the chronological framework of Roman rule, something that is well covered in readings, but at the ideological framework, the conceptual framework of Roman rule. What were the images that Rome projected of itself? What sorts of concepts and narratives did the dominant culture spin for itself and invite people to accept, enter into, participate in, even fully embrace, all with the goal of legitimating Roman rule over an increasing amount of territory. We will look at primarily ways in which Rome, or the expansion of Rome, was portrayed as a divine act, as the outworking of providence, a beneficent providence for the good of the whole world. The map, as it were, of the first century looked very different from our maps of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Actually, very few visuals have survived, and this is a reconstruction of a description of such a map from about the time of Marcus Agrippa, who was Augustus's general and in many ways his right-hand man for most of Augustus's rise to power and rule. According to this description of the world, the Mediterranean Sea lies basically at the center, and around that sea are the circle of the lands, the orbis terrarum in Latin. And the idea here is that the Earth is basically a circle of land with the Mediterranean at the center, and Roman rule is concentrated in the center and is expanding ever outward to the boundaries, to the margins, until finally, when Providence has completed its work, the entire world will be united in one empire and an endless cycle of peace. Virgil was a court poet, as it were, during the time of Augustus. He is most famous for his work, the Aeneid, the story of the founding of, not Rome exactly, but you know what? This is embarrassing. It's been so long since I've read through the whole Aeneid, I can't tell you what that's the founding of what. It's the story of a bunch of refugees from Troy, led by Aeneas, who would become the hero, and their divine commission to find the land of Latium, of course, Italy, and there establish the seed of a new empire. And this empire was to have a divine destiny, to bring the whole world under law's dominion, to rule the sea and all the lands about it. This is building on the conceptual framework of that map that we just looked at. In this poem, this foundation epic for the Roman Empire, Virgil writes that Rome's gifts and graces are to pacify, to impose the rule of law, to spare the conquered and battle down the proud. Pacify here in the sense of to impose peace by any means necessary. In the words of another late first century author, Rome would exercise authority over every tribe and people and language and nation. A second century Christian author by the name of Minucius Felix writes about the Romans' power and authority thus: "It has occupied the circuit of the whole world." Again, the concept of the orbis terrarum, the circle of the lands around the Mediterranean Sea. "Thus it has propagated its empire beyond the paths of the sun and the bounds of the ocean itself." Or returning to John, toward the end of the first century, the great city, Rome is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. In the words of Plutarch, late first, early century Greek author, who praised the destiny of Rome in one of his essays. We find this testimony: Rome developed and grew strong, and attached to herself not only nations and peoples, but foreign kingdoms beyond the sea. And then at last, the world found stability and security, when the controlling power entered into a single, unwavering cycle and world order of peace. So in all of these texts, we find a sense of Rome's expansion, and in many of them, a sense that this was divine destiny. It was the outworking of providence or fortune, a greater force beyond the human sphere, and that this progression was beneficial to the entire world. It brought order, law, peace, security, stability. Now, Rome presented itself in many contexts as a divine figure. The city of Rome was personified as the goddess Roma. On this coin, for example, minted during the reign of Nero, who reigned from, let me remember, 54 to 68 CE, Rome is depicted on the back in full military attire, sitting upon a pile of armor and shields and what have you. And in her hand, she holds a figure. It's barely visible here, but that figure is winged victory, Nike, victory. And victory, in turn, is offering a wreath to Rome. Victory is here, and the wreath is right here. So the ideology here, of course, is a divine personage, a divine entity at the cosmic level, kind of the divine equivalent of the city and power of Rome, presented as a military figure who is being crowned for her victorious successes throughout the world. On the right, we have a better image of the same sort of minting. Again, now victory is clearer here, the figure of victory, and the wreath is a bit clear as well, even down to the ribbon trailing from it. And then on the left, a different sort of depiction of the goddess Roma. Here she is dressed in a toga, and she is holding a scepter, the symbol of rule, of Imperial, of the right to issue commands over the entire empire. And she is leaning against the 7 hills, the celebrated 7 hills of the city of Rome. Now, I just have to say, for scale, the hills are not that big. They're basically 7 mounds. Nevertheless, the coin exaggerates a bit. In one corner, the image of the wolf that suckled Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome. And over here, the river Tiber, which flows through Rome now, beside Rome then, personified as a river god. The goddess Roma was in fact worshipped in temples and cults. This is a 2nd century statue showing the goddess Roma dressed very much like Athena, another goddess of military prowess and victory as she was portrayed during the Greek and Roman periods. And this statue may indeed have been the cult statue that once sat in this temple dedicated to Rome on one side and to Venus on the other. This is a monumental structure that sits across from the Colosseum, between the Colosseum and the Roman Forum. And you can get a sense of the scale of the structure from the people walking in front of it. All that remains of the temple is the backmost area called a cella, where the cult statue would have stood or sat. The bulk of the building is gone, probably a lot of it's reused ancient buildings were relentlessly quarried to make new buildings. And on the reverse side of this is an identical temple. So back to back, there are the statues of Rome and the statue of Venus being worshipped. Now, this was built in the early 2nd century, in the time of Hadrian, so it's a bit later than the New Testament period. Nevertheless, it shows the prominence of the worship of Rome here at the heart of empire itself, but certainly the worship of Rome was universal across the Mediterranean. Venus is chosen probably, by the way, not because she's another lady, but because Venus stands at the heart of the ideology of the first imperial household. Julius Caesar claimed to be a descendant of the goddess Venus, and so a temple to Venus appears in the part of the forum built by Julius Caesar, rather the additional forum built by Julius Caesar, and there are other connections, archaeological as well as numismatic, just reminding the people of this claim to divine heritage of the imperial family. You can find images of the goddess Roma again in many friezes depicting triumphal marches. So here the figure of Roma appears among the triumphant soldiers and their horses on the side of a monument. Rome was not only worshipped, she was fed continuously from every province. The Roman Empire was, above all, an economic development, an economic order, by means of which those at the center of power were able to command and enjoy whatever they wanted throughout the known world. So this testimony, written by the 2nd century traveler and orator Aelius Aristides, gives us a sense of Rome, it really in many ways as a kind of black hole, sucking the provinces dry of their resources, although Aelius himself writes very naively about how great this is that Rome has achieved such prominence. So he writes, "Around lie the continents far and wide, pouring an endless flow of goods to Rome. There is brought from every land and sea whatever is brought forth by the seasons, and is produced by all countries, rivers, lakes, and the skills of Greeks and foreigners. Anyone who wants to behold all these products must either journey through the whole world to see them, or else come to this city. One can see so many cargoes from India, or if you wish from Arabia, that one may surmise that the trees there have been left permanently bare, and that those people must come here whenever they need anything." I wonder if Aelius Aristides realized the dramatic irony of what he was writing, to write in a celebratory way of a power that so soaked up, so consumed the resources of the world, that even with hyperbole, something like this could be said. The legitimacy of the rule of empire, of the Roman Empire, throughout the 1st century was grounded chiefly in the accomplishments of Augustus. We know from readings that Augustus brought an end to a long period of civil war among the political factions of ambitious senators who tried to ally themselves in what we know now as the First and the Second Triumvirates, and also civil wars in the wake of the assassination of Julius Caesar. And all of this, finally, these civil wars that devastated the empire and its resources from about 48 BC to 31 BC, came to an end in 31 BC, when Octavian, as he was known at the time, was the last man standing, and was able to unify what was left of the factions under his own aegis, under his own rule. So in many ways, he is remembered for having brought peace to the entire known world. And he was welcomed as such. He was given titles and powers in reward for his outstanding service to the empire, and really for being painted as the protector of Rome during the latter part of those civil wars against the wiles of Cleopatra and her puppet, the traitor Mark Antony. So Augustus's achievements on behalf of the people, not only the Senate and the people of Rome, but the whole empire, were recorded on stone monuments, fragments of which can still be seen in many cities. This particular fragment comes from as far away from Rome as Pisidian Antioch, one of the cities that Paul evangelized. To see the whole thing would take an entire wall. This is a modern replica of the res gestae, of the things accomplished by the divine Augustus, as he is remembered after his death, carved onto the side of a museum in Rome, and it stretches an entire block, the whole length of this public building. Monuments like this could be found throughout the ancient world, reminding people, should they ever forget, of just how much the world owed to Augustus, and who was the bringer of peace. One of the paragraphs in the Res Gestae celebrates this and recounts how the Senate acknowledged the achievement of peace that Augustus won for people. On my return from Spain and Gaul, after successfully arranging affairs in those provinces, the Senate resolved that an altar of the Augustan peace should be consecrated next to the field of Mars, the Campus Martius, in honor of my return, and they ordered that the magistrates and priests and Vestal virgins should perform an annual sacrifice there. The altar of peace, this altar of the Augustan peace, has been reconstructed inside that same museum on which the Res Gestae are carved. The altar, in fact, is inside this monument. It's this marble slab up there. But the whole thing is about 20 feet by 20 feet, and maybe about a story and a half high. Carved all about with images of a triumphal, or I should say actually a religious procession, in which Augustus and his whole family and other high-ranking Roman officials are featured, as well as other scenes. And this stood in the in really a prominent place in the Roman public spaces. It was celebrated in generations to follow. For example, on this coin of Nero, the altar of peace is recalled for everyone who handled the change on the back. And Pax Augusti, peace, the peace of Augustus, is a very common reverse for coins throughout this period, recalling one of the central benefits of imperial rule. As long as Rome is strong and her armies are doing their job and people are staying in line and provinces aren't revolting, the whole world can enjoy peace, stability, security. This particular coin is minted somewhat ironically by the emperor who arose victorious out of another year of civil wars in 68 to 69 CE, and also was the emperor who, together with his son Titus, was responsible for the suppression of the Judean revolt, which ended in the destruction of Jerusalem itself and its glorious temple. The same Vespasian built a large open square with public buildings, colonnaded porches, and what have you, for gathering, for markets, for whatever might be needed, called the Forum of Peace. And it is thought, although this is still somewhat disputed, that a temple of peace also stood on the premises here. This was probably built sometime between 75 and 80. I think I got that right. AD or CE. Part of the ever-expanding project of the Central Roman Forum. The Roman Forum had its basic shape in the end of the Republican era, but many of the successive emperors added to it because the city was growing so fast and the need for such usable public space was growing. When Vespasian added his contribution to this growing forum space, it was dedicated to peace. It's a very important part of Roman imperial ideology, and strikingly so when one considers the aggressive expansionist policies of Rome. We should remember that even when Rome was a republic, it was an empire. The Roman Republic, before the rise of Julius Caesar to sole rule, already included large parts of what we now know as Spain and France and Greece and the western part of Turkey, then around Syria, and a good chunk of North Africa. And 100 years later, it had greatly expanded its westward holdings to include all of Spain and Gaul, which is France pushing into modern Germany, and then of course has pushed a lot further into the inner part of Europe, all along the Mediterranean coast, has taken the whole of North Africa, including Egypt, and even extended its territory to include Britain, which never really held on too well, but it kept trying. It expanded its eastward holdings all the way to the gates of the Parthian kingdom. So even while it is celebrating the peace of Augustus and talking about peace and stability and security as the hallmarks of Roman rule, as some of the great divine gifts that Rome has brought to the world, it is also, out of the other side of its mouth, celebrating its conquests. For example, this minting, which came out when Octavian had successfully defeated Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Egypt taken, Egypt captured. And then Armenia, which had been a client kingdom and then at some point revolted, Armenia taken. Early in the 2nd century AD, under the Emperor Trajan, under whom, incidentally, the Roman Empire gained its greatest breadth of territory, we even find Parthia defeated, with this issue, Parthia capta, Parthia taken. And of course, under Vespasian and under his son Titus, we find many issues bearing the inscription Judea or Judea capta, Judea taken, commemorating the suppression of the Jewish revolt. So it is with a commendable degree of self-awareness, I would say, that the historian Tacitus, himself a Roman senator, resident in Rome at the heart of empire, as he writes about Roman conquests, for example, in his history of his father-in-law's exploits in Britain, I believe, possibly Germany. I guess I need to read these things again. He has a non-Roman chieftain talking about the real nature of Roman rule thus: to violence, rapine, and plunder they give the name government. They make a desert and call it peace. That's a remarkable perspective, and it's certainly a perspective shared by some provincials, at least in the empire, not least of which the residents, many of the residents of the province of Judea, who would revolt against Roman rule in 66 to 70 AD. Nevertheless, despite its actual military practices, peace and security were its major watchwords. Now, providence plays a very forthright role here as well. We saw this in the texts from Virgil's Aeneid. It's also displayed rather prominently, for example, in coins. This is a coin again from the reign of Trajan, who was emperor from 98 to 117 AD, so first part of the 2nd century, a bit later than the New Testament period. But on the reverse of this silver denarius, we find a representation of Providence, shown as a goddess, pro aug, abbreviation for Providentia Augusti, the providence of Augustus, of the emperor. She rests her elbow upon a pillar, a symbol of stability, and at her feet, not one of those exercise balls, but rather a representation of the earth. So there's this visual depiction of, in effect, the gods providing stability for the earth. The earth rests stable because the gods are at work through the emperor. Now, this is not just ideology that developed early in the 2nd century. It was already well in place by the first years of the 1st century, as seen in this inscription from the community in Asia Minor, the city Priene, where the provincial council, I shouldn't say that, they didn't meet in Priene. The inscription was put in many cities of Asia Minor, and the provincial council of Asia Minor made a decree resetting the start of the year at the birthday of Octavian Augustus, who was named Augustus, really as a way of flattering Augustus and presenting themselves as loyal and grateful clients of Augustus, but also articulating very clearly the ideology of the rule of the emperor. Because Providence has set all things in most perfect order by giving us Augustus, whom she filled with virtue that he might benefit humankind, sending him as a savior, both for us and for our descendants, that he might end war and arrange all things well, and because he, Caesar, by his appearing, surpassed all previous benefactors, and leaves posterity no hope of another surpassing what he has done, and because the birthday of the god Augustus was the beginning of the good tidings for the world that came by reason of him, and the inscription goes on, we have decided to start the calendar off with September 23rd, Augustus's birthday. That is the New Year's Day, because it is really the start of a new age, a golden age for the world. Now, the language of this decree is nothing short of messianic, and many of the terms, the ones I've highlighted here by providing the underlying Greek, are words that we will also find applied to Jesus. Again, sent by providence, by God, sent as a savior, bringing peace. The word epiphany, appearing, comes to be associated, maybe not so much in 1st century discourse, but a lot more in 2nd century discourse, with Christ's coming. And the message of his coming is good tidings, euangelion, from which we get the word evangelism. But it's important to note that the word gospel, euangelion, was not invented by Christians for the message of Jesus Christ or about Jesus Christ. It was already part of the established vocabulary of Roman imperial rule and its legitimation. All that to say how subversive the Christian gospel could be heard to be by the non-Christian Romans around them. Now, Augustus himself was given the office, like Julius Caesar, his adoptive father, of Pontifex Maximus. That's Latin for chief priest or high priest. So, in addition to his other titles, his political titles, he was also the chief mediator between the Roman world and the gods. He's portrayed in this statue from the Vatican Museum, in the dress that he would be wearing, performing sacrifice, holding the patera, a small dish, I think on which there would have been incense, which he presumably here just tossed onto a fire, a sacrificial fire. This is a title that his successors would all also have. This is a coin of Tiberius, and on the reverse, Maxim Pontiff, Pontifex Maximus. And all the emperors would also be the chief mediators between gods and human beings in this way. From quite late in the 2nd century, a picture, not a picture, but a frieze, a carved relief of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, also with his head covered with the drape of priestly toga, also holding the dish, this time dumping the sacrifice over the fire, in front of the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. Jupiter as the cult on the Capitoline Hill of Rome, incidentally worshipped alongside Juno, his wife, and Athena, his daughter, as a Capitoline trio in this one temple. But it wasn't enough to portray the emperors as the chief priests of the world, the mediators between gods and humans. They also came to be the objects of worship. And this is in many ways the supreme legitimation of power in the Roman world. It again is, it grows out of the expression of gratitude toward these leaders, as well as the estimation of their power, their ability to confer benefits, their place, their prestige in the world. They were more than men. They were greater than human beings. And the line between human and God was very blurry in the classical world, which was itself populated mythically with demigods left and right, the children of a god and a human parent, for example. It was a world in which great rulers and even liberating generals who freed a city would be given worship, because it seemed that since they brought the gifts for which people prayed, it was only fitting to give them the thanks, typically given to those to whom one prayed. Now, in this testimony from Nicholas of Damascus, who was a personal friend of Herod the Great, who was himself a personal friend of Augustus, we find this explanation of the growth of the cult of Augustus. All people address him as Augustus. That is a term of reverence. Augustus means revered as well as pious, in accordance with their estimation of his honor, revering him with temples and sacrifices across islands and continents, organized in cities and provinces, matching the greatness of his virtue and repaying his benefactions toward them. We mustn't imagine that imperial cult was something imposed upon the world simply by power-hungry, megalomaniac, narcissistic emperors. There were a few of those, like like Caligula or Nero in his later years, but they ended up assassinated or killing themselves before they could be colorfully assassinated. Augustus didn't encourage worship of himself. He insisted in many ways that it be limited, and that no temple ever be erected to him unless it was also erected to the goddess Roma, thus really diverting attention, at least back home in Rome, away from himself as setting himself apart from his senatorial, not quite peers, but just under peers, but rather including them and including everything that Rome represented wherever he would be worshipped. Rather, the cult of the emperors was encouraged locally, as people considered the power and the gifts and the interventions and the benefits, that's gifts, of these figures, and of course wanted to present themselves as loyal and grateful recipients of past favors so that they would enjoy future favors. Now, imperial cult in Rome really got its start after the death of Julius Caesar. Augustus, and, well, when he was Octavian, with the full support of the Senate, declared Julius Caesar to be divine after his death. Again, because his accomplishments, his achievements, proved him to be more than a mortal. On this coin we find, of course, Octavian, at this point already known as Augustus, Caesar Augustus, depicted on the front. But on the back, Divus Iulius, the divinized Julius, depicted by a comet, which was believed to have been seen at the time of his death, a symbol of his soul ascending to divinity. A temple was built for the worship of the divine Julius in the heart of the Roman Forum itself. All that remains, of course, is basically the foundations, the pediment, but originally this was a sizable structure in which sacrifices were offered to the deceased divinized emperor. It was erected, incidentally, over the place where he was believed to have been. Such temples were built across the Mediterranean. Another, what would have been once a sizable structure, was erected for the worship of Divus Iulius and the dea Roma, to divine Julius and the goddess Rome, in Ephesus, in the middle of its civic forum. So in a very public place where governmental, political, civic functions were conducted. Here's a picture of the foundations again from another angle. In the background, actually we'll talk about this in a moment, but is the location of yet another temple dedicated to imperial cult. So very prominent in the city of Ephesus. Earlier, before the erection of this temple to Julius and Rome, there was a portion of the Temple of Artemis, not the famous Temple of Artemis, but a much smaller one, right next to the city hall in Ephesus, a portion dedicated to the worship of Julius Caesar. And again, I think it's significant to note how the worship of the emperor, as well as the worship of, in this case, a traditional local goddess, Artemis, are just placed in the middle of political and civic affairs like this. Government is constantly kind of self-legitimating through association with the worship of the traditional gods. Soon after the imperial cult got its start, the provinces began petitioning for the right to build temples to the living emperors as well. This was not done in Rome. There were only temples to deceased emperors that were divinized there. But here, for example, is a coin celebrating really, the building and the dedication of a temple in Pergamum, in Asia Minor, to Rome and to Augustus. This was one of the claims to fame of the city of Pergamum, that it was the temple keeper, the temple warden in Asia Minor, for the cult of Augustus, the great Augustus. This temple actually continues to be featured throughout the 1st century on on coins minted in Asia. Again, I think this is a denarius. It might be a tetradrachm, which is a larger coin. In any event, during the reign of Claudius, this same reverse is brought out and improved, and one can see here the cult images, first of the goddess Roma, holding a cornucopia as a symbol of the prosperity that Rome has brought, and it certainly did, to the province of Asia Minor, especially to port cities like Ephesus, major metropolis like Pergamum. And Roma is extending a wreath of victory toward the head of the cult statue of Augustus. The same reverse, not so well preserved, probably not so well carved into the die to begin with, nevertheless from the reign of Domitian, who reigned from 81 to 96 AD, toward the end of the 1st century. But the imperial cult then, the cult of Rome and Augustus, is so important for civic identity that the commune of Asia, the provincial council of Asia, keeps it in front of the eyes of people as much as possible. A temple to Rome and Augustus was even built in Athens, right behind the Parthenon on the Acropolis. If I remember correctly, this is the only building constructed on the Acropolis during the Roman period. But it was that important to include the worship of the goddess Roma and the emperor on this most sacred mountain in the city of Athens. An extremely well-preserved temple to Rome and Augustus remains in France, here giving us probably our best sense of what these temples looked like and what they said about the emperor on the throne and about the city that was at the center of power in the Mediterranean. Again, just be careful to note the people here for the scale of this building. Coins also keep bearing witness to the divinity of the emperors. This is a coin minted by Tiberius after the death of Augustus, celebrating his divinity, his divinization. Divus Augustus, the divine Augustus, Pater, the father. In many ways, the father of the fatherland became an important title for emperors. They presented themselves as thus the chief patron of the Roman world. And on the back, an altar to Providence, again reminding visually the connection, people of the connection between the divine plans, the God's plans for the world, and the achievements of emperors like Augustus. From later in the 1st century, perhaps around 79-80 AD, a coin minted shortly after Vespasian's death, proclaiming his divinity. He was made a god also by the Senate of Rome, Divus Augustus Vespasianus. And on the reverse, victory, again that figure of Nike, winged victory, holding a Roman standard, an army standard, and down here, really very crudely crafted, but still, this would be a Jew, a captive Jew. So this is part of the ongoing celebration of the Flavian family's suppression of the Jewish revolts. In the heart of the old Roman Forum, called Rorum for short apparently, next to the temple of Saturn, one of the most ancient temples in the Forum, Titus was able to squeeze in a temple to the divine Vespasian. Titus, of course, died only 2 years after ascending to the throne himself, so Domitian finished off the temple. Domitian, the younger brother of Titus, the younger son of Vespasian, finished off the temple, and it was now dedicated to both Vespasian and Titus together. Domitian himself was the recipient of cult. Very famously, because so many remains can be seen, very famously in Ephesus, where a gigantic temple complex was erected for the worship of the living Domitian, since that could happen outside of Rome itself. The natural mound, the natural plateau, had been greatly extended with the use of artificial arches and foundations, so that the temple could be crafted at a scope befitting Domitian's grandeur. I do think that the artist has overdone the layers of the foundation. I don't see how that could be supported myself, but I'm not an archaeologist. Nevertheless, it gives you a good sense of the artificial extension of the plateau and then the original scope of the temple to Domitian itself, which would have then overlooked, in many ways towered above, some of the important civic spaces, the most important political and civic spaces in downtown Ephesus. Parts of the cult statue from the temple have been recovered, namely the left forearm and the head itself. Now it is debated whether this represents Titus or Domitian. Was it a temple to the Flavian family, or was it just a temple to Domitian? In any event, the cult image of the emperor, the representation of the emperor in Ephesus at the end of the 1st century, was this 20 to 24 foot colossus, exemplifying the power, the superhuman character of the emperor as he was experienced and thought of in the provinces. Every temple has to have an altar, and this was the altar from the Flavian temple, or the temple to Domitian, where sacrifices were performed not merely on behalf of the emperor, but to the divine spirit of the emperor. At one end of the altar, a sacrificial scene with an altar and a sacrificial animal, a bull, tied to it, ready to be offered. Not to be outdone, Pergamum went through the expense of adding another temple to its Acropolis, also artificially extending the platform, the brow of the hill, so as to make the whole temple precincts sufficiently grand. This temple dedicated to Trajan, who was effectively the next major emperor after Domitian. Nerva, an old senator, did take over after Domitian's assassination, but he only lasted 18 to 24 months, somewhere in there. And his adopted son, his marked successor, was Trajan, to whom this magnificent temple was erected. Again, some people there for scale. An artist's reconstruction of the large temple precinct to Trajan, and the amount of it which required the artificial extension of the platform over the side of what is basically a cliff overlooking Pergamum. And this gave Pergamum another claim to fame. Both Ephesus and Pergamum were very proud to be hosts of imperial cult temples. Pergamum had been named Neokoros, host of the imperial cult, for his temple to Augustus, and was named a second time Neokoros, for its magnificent temple to Trajan. Ephesus had won that title for itself for the first time with its temple to Domitian. Now we have to remember, it's not all about buildings and statues. It's about regular practice of sacrifice, celebration, hymnody, worship, involving real people going through these cities, worshipping the emperors as they would worship any other god. Thus, Leonard Thompson, in his study, writes, "Imperial temples and sanctuaries were wreathed with flowers. Animals were sacrificed at various altars throughout the city, the main locations of the city, for example, the council house, temples of other deities, theaters, the main squares, stadiums, and gymnasiums. These political, religious, and public buildings were linked together by processions of dignitaries, garlanded animals being led to slaughter, and bearers of icons and symbols of the emperor. As the procession passed by, householders would sacrifice on small altars outside their homes. The whole city thus had opportunity to join in the celebration. This would happen throughout a year. There were many festivals linked with the various cults of the emperors in any given major city. The names of divinity were always associated, or almost always associated, with the emperors on coins. We've already seen Divus Augustus Vespasianus, but even a living emperor would regularly refer to himself, or be referred to on these coins, as Divi Augusti Filius, the son of the divine Augustus, in the case of Tiberius Caesar. So there are always these claims to divinity associated with even the currency of the realm. Here's a coin minted during the reign of Caligula, and it shows actually not an emperor on the front, but it shows the figure of piety, portrayed as a woman, a goddess. Virtues were regularly personified as women, as female deities. So, and piety is here being expressed by Caligula on the reverse, making an offering, acting as Pontifex Maximus, acting as chief priest, making an offering to the divine Augustus, to his predecessor in front of the temple of Augustus. So as we think about Rome in the 1st century, we have to continually bear in mind Rome's power, based in its military might and its economic power. But also we should remain aware of the ways in which this power was legitimated, how it was portrayed so that people would accept it, even embrace it as a good thing, as the outworking of, for example, providence, the God's provision for the good of humanity, shown in Rome's rise, to have an empire, to unite the world in a single empire, and to rule those territories better than they had ever ruled themselves. And providence at work through Rome and her emperors for the world's good, bringing, for example, peace and stability, as well as many other benefits that are continually celebrated on the reverses of these coins and in other ways. The divine achievement of Rome and her emperors is perhaps nowhere more blatantly displayed, propagandized, than in its divine cult, the cult of Rome, the cult of the various emperors, mostly rooted in the reverence and the cult shown to Augustus, the first true emperor, itself rooted in the claim of Augustus to being the son of the divine Julius, not the natural son, but the adoptive son of the divine Julius. So that in many ways imperial cult became a means by which individual citizens across the Mediterranean, especially the Eastern Mediterranean, acknowledged the divinity and therefore the propriety, the rightness of Rome's power over them. This is the world, and this the ideology, into which the Christian gospel would make its way. This was the fabric, the conceptual and ideological fabric, through which the proclamation of another Savior, another kingdom that would bring a truer peace, that would indeed last forever, began to tear.